What's up guys, it's me, Jeremy. We're trying out some new audio editing effects in this video. I think they sound really good, so hopefully you guys do too. Anyways, among the more interesting and controversial mechanics that exist in League of Legends, creep block is something that sticks out to me as peculiar. Most players probably see it as a frustrating or unfair mechanic, but I wanted to take a deeper look. Also, just a heads up, when this video goes live, I'll be giving away a few pieces of Razor gear and a bunch of RP with some friends, and it's super easy to enter, just check the link in the description. Anyways, let's get started. So the first thing to look at is why creep block exists. Creep block is a mechanic that comes from the original Defense of the Ancients mod of Warcraft 3, and it consists of the unit collision between your character and minions or monsters. In the original Dota, the mechanic was unavoidable because it was a part of the Warcraft 3 engine, since it was a mod. When League was being made, the mechanic was preserved for the sake of consistency and because, let's be fair here, the mechanic does make sense on paper for the most part, since creeps should have interactive hitboxes. In League of Legends, creep block had a much smaller impact, and there's also been several mechanics to remove creep block altogether, such as Phantom Dancer's old passive or Fizz's current passive. However, creep block ended up having a different impact in League of Legends. What ended up happening is that many things in the game were coded as minions, or coded in a way that involved the functions of minions. And with my limited experience with programming, I can say that when you tackle huge projects like a game, League of Legends, among the various tricks programmers use, a lot of the coding is done in a way to reuse or recycle a lot of the pieces in order to save time and therefore money. And it works because you can design the code to be flexible and reusable to all kinds of different scenarios, and so you can create kind of like a template to base things off of that you can add to, take away, change a bit, and this is essentially what happened with minions in League of Legends. This resulted in some abilities such as Jarvan's ultimate or Anivia's wall and a lot of other aspects of the game to essentially be coded as minions. And it's that relation that causes minion blocking to be almost impossible to remove from the game in its current state, because if you try to remove creep block, it's going to completely break all of those mechanics. And so in order to remove creep block completely, it would require huge fundamental changes to the code of the game, which is a project that is pretty unrealistic. So this is why creep block exists, and why it is for the most part probably never going to go away. And as the game progressed, creep block in League developed into what we now see as a harmful mechanic for a few reasons. The biggest one being that the mechanic, and more importantly its consistency, became really frustrating to deal with. Throughout constant changes attempting to lessen the significance of creep block, it evolved into something that you don't really expect or think about in the back of your mind, since it's so subtle, so when it screws you over out of nowhere, it feels really bad and is uncommon enough to make you feel like you got really unlucky, even though it is a legitimate mechanic. On top of that, it's a little bit more unfair for melee champions, especially in lane versus range champions, because they have to path properly to actively avoid creep block more than their opponent otherwise would. And it's definitely worth noting that the way that creep block interacts with pathing in the game isn't always as intuitive as it could be, and overall we're left with a mechanic that feels like it has no upsides. And that's actually where a lot more of the problem stems from. The perceived notion about creep block being a bad mechanic makes people think it is much worse than it actually is, when in reality it's not that crazy and only ever comes up once in a blue moon. There's definitely been a few patches where there was an exception and the mechanic was a lot more complicating, but for the most part, creep block gets touted as this negative thing that is so frustrating, when in reality, well, that's only partly true, and there's some unappreciated upsides that the mechanic brings to the table. So the biggest upside that creep block gives is that it creates a dynamic of being able to interact with minions in the game, outside of them just blocking skill shots. Creep block causes minions to have just a little bit more depth and a little bit more interaction to your gameplay, creating a dynamic in the laning phase where it has a big influence on positioning and other factors. And so it does add some strategical depth to the minions, since you can use creep block to your advantage in some ways, or be put at a disadvantage depending on how you play around it, and manipulate creeps through aggro and wave control. And when implemented properly, that is a reasonable mechanic to have in a game where you can base strategies and techniques around creep blocking minions that is interactive, interesting, and rewards skill. which really boils us down to the source of the problem, which is the way that creep lock is handled in League. From what I can tell, the way Riot handles creep lock is to try and make the mechanic as unimpactful as possible, essentially trying to get as close to removing the mechanic as much as they possibly can without breaking the game. Now, I don't think that's a bad idea at all, really. In fact, it's pretty good. It's just that because of the coding limitations, it ends up being this half mess of a mechanic that you can't interact with in a positive way until it pops up in a bad situation and screws you over. Continuing with the Dota example from previous, in Dota 2 right now, creep block is a huge factor. It's very significant, and it's much more difficult to walk through a group of minions compared to in League, so it has a huge influence on the laning phase, positioning, wave control, and all kinds of other random things. The creeps create an element of gameplay that is interactive, interesting, and most importantly, consistent. They embrace the mechanic, support it, and well, okay, to be fair, I don't play a lot of Dota, but from what it sounds like, the mechanic is executed well. Now, I don't think you can necessarily say that Dota has it better, because if League handled creep block in the way that it was intending to, it would actually be pretty good. So although the execution of the mechanic in Dota is better, the design of the mechanic in both games is reasonably on par. You can't really say the concept of having creep block versus not having creep block is better or worse, it's just different. And with all of that said, I would really like to see Riot take a consistent stance on creep block. Either they want it to exist, or they don't. Because at the moment, we are stuck in the middle and left with something that in its current state is a really weird and uninteractive mechanic to have in the game. So, what do you think about creep block in League of Legends? Leave a comment, tap that like button, and thanks for watching.
Her body's gold like September. She burns through the night like an ember. And all those things we try forgetting, I remember. But we say we all fine, we all fine. Sunny day dreams and we up now. Vodka lemonade, I serve it up, it goes down.